This week, I took a last-minute trip on Via Rail over to Ottawa, a city quietly building a massive amount of new transit, as well as bike and pedestrian infrastructure. Line 1 and 2 of the O-Train system are being expanded, taking the network from 18 stations on 20 kilometers of track to 44 stations on 63 kilometers of track, suddenly making Ottawa among the larger rail networks for a city of its size on this continent. I got to see the truly impressive progress on site firsthand, so come along. This is one of the largest transit expansion programs in North America, and most people haven't heard about it. The initial issues with Line 1 of the O-Train overwhelmed a lot of the news about the incredible task of more than doubling the system length, which will make it almost as long as the Montreal Metro, despite the system only first opening just 3 years ago, which I was of course there to see. Now, to address the elephant in the room, those issues on the system seem to have improved a lot, and I hope to see that continue. The reality is, as time goes on, experience running the system and maintaining it should increase. I'm still super impressed with the headways on the system as well. Most of the time I was riding it to travel around Ottawa, I never had to wait more than a few minutes for a train. At the same time, part of the issue with the current system seems to be related to the heavy loading onto the trains that happens at the terminal stations right now, thanks to the truncation of the transitways both to the east and to the west. So getting the line extended, and thus letting people board gradually as the trains get into the city, should help a lot. On my trip, we were focused on seeing the expansion of Line 1, east with 5 stations on 12 kilometers of track, and west with 11 stations on 15 kilometers of track. I'll probably do another video in the future on the south expansion of the system as well, though I did discuss it in a video last week. The whole day actually started with a proper press event on track laying, which we took some of Ottawa's electric buses to. I made a video on the same model of bus which Toronto is also using previously, and it was great getting on these electric buses again. And I have to say the lack of noise and vibration from a diesel engine makes riding way more comfortable. We arrived on site in the median of the 174, which was shifted to accommodate rail but wasn't widened. At the same time, the project is adding lots of new sound mitigation measures, which means everyone should be better off when work is complete. Tracks are starting to go in, with foundations for catenary poles also moving along. These long and straight sections of alignment are why having the high top speeds of the trains is so important. The value of this extension is clearly pretty massive. Tons of buses were going by the entire time we were there, all of which were diesel and decently loud. Now, there were some speeches and signing of sleepers, but before long the event was over and the real fun began. For the rest of the day, I got an excellent tour around the various sites on the Line 1 expansion. We started by traveling along the 174 and looking at the giant flyover which will bring the line into the median of the freeway. At the same time, there was also the old bus flyover which was being prepared for demolition. We then went to the various stations which were in various states of completion, starting at Montreal Road, then passing Jeanne d'Arc, which we got a better look at by walking around. The station was coming along really nicely. All stations have a similar topology, accessed by crossings of the freeway, though the Montreal Road station, unlike all the others, has the rail line and highway above the road. Traveling down the highway, platforms were also becoming visible at Convent Glen, Orleans, and Trim. At Orleans, you could see the supports for a new pedestrian bridge. The old one will be maintained, allowing for anyone to cross the highway without paying to ride the trains or buses outside of the fare paid zone. I do have to say as well, as with the existing O-Train system, the environments were amazing. At least after spending so much time cooped up in Toronto, tons of green space and rocky terrain, which Ottawa is known for. But it's also amazing just how close to the Ottawa River and literal farm fields the future Trim Road station will be. And of course, all of these lovely environments will be accessible by modern electric rail. At Trim, there was also a new park and ride under construction, as well as road relocations. The new park and rides are surface lots, so they could be turned into future transit-oriented developments, which you can wildly already see all the way out here close to the edge of the urban area. Again, we aren't far from farm fields and the like. The scale of the sites and the amount of work being done was impressive, and this extension is meant to be done in just about 2.5 years, which seems realistic. What was also really cool was the addition of loads of new pedestrian and cycling infrastructure on paths along the corridor, including new bridges. The O-Train is a true transportation and city building project, not just a new transit line. Now, stations are more minimal than the first phase, but they're also in less urban areas. It's also hard not to appreciate that 44 kilometers of new rail is being delivered in about 5 years for $4.6 billion, which is far, far, far less than most North American urban areas, sometimes by a factor of 10. The stations and alignment on the east is all above ground surface running, but it will still be a subway level of service, taking lessons from cities like Perth, which I recently did a video on. After seeing the eastern section, we got to see the western extension, which is much more engineering intensive and densely packed with stations than the east. Also, unlike the east, and more like the initial section of line, much of the west is being built on converted transitway BRT corridors. Now, on both the Line 1 extensions, the line is departing from previously converted transitway stations, which means that work begins directly east of Blair and west of Tunney's Pasture to extend the railway. I have to say, walking around some of these sites too, that the bike infrastructure makes me really jealous in Toronto. This stuff shouldn't need to be hard, and it's great how much Ottawa has, not to mention the numerous multi-use paths. Doing the conversion from BRT to rail is complex because all those buses and riders need to go somewhere, so there's a need to build high-quality, high-capacity temporary BRT infrastructure, which makes this replacement in place actually possible. For the western extension, the first few stations are in trench, and it's hard work to expand and modify the trench next to a lot of residential areas, with some substantial density. Of course, in exchange, these areas will get great transit access, being able to be downtown in a few minutes, every few minutes. Westboro, you can see, is getting ready to start construction. The hardest parts of the line's construction started earlier so that the transitway could operate for longer. Since the trench is already here, these sections will be faster to build. New bus roadways and large temporary surface stops and even a rapidly deployed bridge have been built to temporarily divert the transitway. At the same time, sound mitigation was in full swing, with audio monitoring equipment and fence-mounted sound barriers, which were an interesting thing to see. Now, west of the trench, the transitway runs part of its length along a parkway, not dissimilar from the east. But adjacent to the parkway, after exiting the trench, the line enters a really substantial tunnel, which is being built cut and cover. The scale of the work and the amount of work going on is amazing, and it's hard to appreciate until you see it in person, though disruption honestly didn't feel that bad. Even contrasting with a project like the Eglinton Crosstown in Toronto, work only felt slightly more intense. The first portion we actually saw was the transition into the tunnel adjacent to the parkway, and again, it's really hard to get a sense of how large and deep the tunnel is until you stand over it. After seeing that section, we headed to the street adjacent to the cut and cover tunnel section and actually walked right down into the future tunnel. You could actually see some of the stations already emerging, which was really impressive. And by keeping the stations open, fire requirements are actually relaxed. This section of route moves the transit closer to the people, as opposed to the previous bus service, and it's being built under a revitalized linear park, which will connect to the stations and is already being surrounded by very nice new high-density transit-oriented development. Continuing west, the tunnel actually crosses the roadway twice, before emerging as we approach the next major station site, Lincoln Fields, where the line branches south and west. You can actually see the ramp already emerging here. Lincoln Fields is really far along, maybe even more so than the stations in the east, and I like that this is an impressive structure, because it's going to be heavily used for transferring around the network, and thus it feels similar in scale to those stations seen on Stage 1, and is visually similar with the sharp roofline. Somewhat uniquely, unlike branch point stations on, say, the SkyTrain, Lincoln Fields has 3 platforms, which is nice because riders will be able to travel straight to the platforms served by trains to their destination. And if you're wondering, the dated old station building visible in the background will be removed in the future. After going around Lincoln Fields, we traveled south on the transitway, and you got a real sense for the massive undertaking that building new rail transit in the city is. So many multi-use paths and roads have to be moved or redirected. But when it's all said and done, they should be better connected than they are today to transit. And at the same time, just as with the eastern portion of the line, new pedestrian bridges are going in. Something really cool we got to see when traveling down the corridor was the flyover for the western branch's inbound trains. This will enable high frequencies to operate on the branches, and unlike in Vancouver, the supposed plan will be to operate one branch as a shuttle during off-peak periods in order to maintain higher frequencies, which is a nice touch. With regard to the layout here, it's actually quite similar to the flyovers seen in Richmond for the Canada Line, except at surface level, with the tracks south remaining together and the tracks west splitting. I've mentioned in previous videos how complex doing work in an active transit corridor can be, such as during the Davenport Diamond project in Toronto. And on this project, it's the same situation, though instead of having a train come every half hour, you have high-speed buses every few minutes. At Iris Street, a new road bridge is going in, and so the current road was relocated. There's also a creek relocation here, which we went to see, and the scale of which was once again quite impressive. This section of line reminded me a lot of Vancouver's Evergreen Line, with all of the foliage and the creek running along the future rail line. It's also worth pointing out here that it can be easy to forget just how many bridges, culverts, and tunnels are needed to build a project like this. just the site has a number of different bridges and other structures which needed to be built. As we continued along, we arrived at the Algonquin College Station, which is likely to be very busy, both because of the college and because it will be a transfer point for services further to the south. What was especially cool here is that we actually got to walk into the future South Station House, which was coming along nicely. The underground station box here was actually pre-constructed prior to the project, and so work at the station is less intense than at other underground stations. That said, the scale of the works is still quite interesting. Now, because of time constraints, we didn't see the stations further to the west, but they aren't so different from those we see on other parts of the line, such as Lincoln Fields, with overhead concourses and platforms below. Further at the western end of the system will be the second maintenance yard on the Confederation line, a light one past Moody's Station, a good part of the way to the Stage 3 destination of Canada. This facility will just be used for minor work like cleaning and storage of trains, and will mean shorter trips back out and in at the beginning and end of service, since the main facility is east of the city centre. It's worth noting though that this facility has the capacity to be expanded in the future for service like things such as Stage 3, which itself seems to be moving along. This means it could be expanded sooner than later, as the first maintenance facility was. All in all, the trip was really cool, and it still amazes me how quietly Ottawa is building this giant light metro system. I think coming back to the city in a few years will highlight a ton of different change, and as operations continue to get more reliable and the system gets burned in, we'll hopefully see a much more transit-oriented Ottawa. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.